Welcome back to Bass Capital Radio Podcast. I'm your host, Lara Wallace, and today I have the honor of sitting here with Mr. Rob Mattson, who is a Civil War reenactor, correct?
Yes.
Wonderful. And
we also say living history.
That's right, living history. So Brianna and Hannah came on and they shared that with me. So shame on me for not remembering that. And you came with all kinds of incredible stuff. And I'm very excited to hear all about what you've got in here. But before we do that, you've been doing the reenactment here in Putnam County for how long?
So the Occupation of Palatka event coming up the end of September, this will be the 14th year. I've been helping organize it for about half that time, about the past 7 or 8 years. It started in 2011. I attended that first one and the subsequent ones, but back then the main organizers were Conrad and Elizabeth Van Rensburg, the Historical Society, and Gary Grafweg, who lives over in the South Side Historic District.
Now, did you live in Putnam County and found your way upon that, or have you been here your whole life? Or
I've been here in Putnam County since 2005.
Okay.
So when the event started in 2011, I was already here. And
wonderful. And have you been into history or?
I kind of first really got into this about 20 years ago in 2004. My wife did this for a little while when we lived in Lake City. A fellow she used to work with in Hillsborough County got into it, and he would come up to attend the Battle of Olustee, which is east of Lake City. And he would come up usually the night before and stop and visit us a little bit. Sometimes we let him camp out on our front lawn in our subdivision, which was a trip. But then she got into it for a while and lost interest, eventually. But then I sort of decided to give it a try. I was involved with a friends group with the Cedar Keys National Wildlife Refuge over on the Gulf Coast. And that refuge includes a island with a historic lighthouse, the Seahorse Key Lighthouse, which was a Civil War lighthouse.
Oh, wow.
It was active during the Civil War. It served as a base for the Union Navy. And there's a cemetery on that island with some Union Navy sailors buried there. And we had a big celebration. It was like the 150th anniversary of the lighthouse and the 75th anniversary of the refuge. And so we bought a headstone for one of the Union Navy sailors because his was originally wood, which had degraded.
Oh, yeah.
So we bought the little white marble like you see at the military cemeteries. And so I put together a Union naval officer's impression to sort of serve for the dedication. And it was after that I was contacted by a reenactors group that does Union Navy, and I fell in with them, started going to events, and, I guess the rest is history.
But I like that.
Yeah, so been involved with Civil War reenacting in general, and in particular, the naval impressions since 2004.
Now, what brought you to Putnam County?
I went to work for the majority of my career. I'm an aquatic biologist, ecologist. I worked about half of a 35-year career with the Swanee River Water Management District to the west of us over in the Swanee Valley. And then in 2005, I took a job with the St. Johns River Water Management District, which, of course, their main headquarters is just outside of town here by the airport.
Yeah.
And, of course, that's what brought me to Putnam County.
That's a trend of the day because my first guest, I asked them how they got to Putnam County, and they too came for a job with St. John's Water Management. So I guess that is the theme of the day here. Now, obviously, you had some part of historical interest prior to moving here, but was that something you were interested in as a child, or?
Actually not, and I used to thought history was just boring, and,
Yeah.
I was always interested in science and some outdoor stuff, scuba diving and fishing and all that kind of thing. So really, I didn't really start to immerse in history until I started to do the living history. And then, of course, as part of it, you do your research. I've got this massive library of Civil War naval literature and books and all that kind of thing, which you do to try to do the most accurate impression that you can. That's what this thing is called. It's called an impression.
Okay. And so an impression is what you gather from your research to be the most historically accurate representation of what was going on then?
Right. Your uniform, your equipment, how you present yourself and that kind of thing. So all that goes, and your knowledge. So yeah, all of that goes into what we call your impression in this hobby.
Okay. Very nice. I found very interesting. One of the, I guess, impressions was the mourning aspect when somebody had lost a loved one, or a lot of time during the war, my understanding is that they spent a lot of time in mourning because of the deaths that were going on. So so you really, at least here in Putnam County, you have the ability to keep some of your science aquatic type stuff mixed in with history, because we've got the resources which are conjoined. So best of both worlds.
Yeah, I volunteer at the River Center right next door here. I'm on the board of directors of the Bartram Trail Society of Florida, Sam's group. So definitely stay active that way. I'm on a couple of advisory boards, the Science Advisory Boards, the Florida Springs Institute, and the Reunite the Rivers campaign.
Oh, that's incredible. So you really are using your knowledge and interest to serve in many ways in this community.
And this week I go back to teaching at St. John's River State College. So.
And what are you teaching?
I'll be teaching a Introduction to Biology course over in St. Augustine this fall semester.
That was probably one of my favorite courses in college, and in high school at the time we had biology. I loved biology. So, well, I wish you the best of luck in that for sure. I see a wagon full of items, and you're like one of the go-to when it comes to history. I hear your name quite a bit. It seems like you're very knowledgeable. So I would love for you to share what you brought with us and share with the viewers. I mean, we've got so much history in Putnam County, and it seems like you can help us out visualize it.
Do we want to talk a little bit about the occupation, what we're doing?
I'd love to, yeah, absolutely.
So what this event is all about, and we are portraying a real historical event that occurred in Palatka and Putnam County history. So going back to 1864, in February of 1864, the largest Civil War battle in Florida was fought west of here, about 60, 70 miles west of here at a little railroad station called Olustee. And that was the Battle of Olustee. You sometimes also see it called the Battle of Ocean Pond, because that was a big lake nearby. So again, largest battle in Florida, a large Union force of about 6,000 troops headed west out of Jacksonville. They were landed at Jacksonville and they headed west. I've seen various accounts of what their objectives were. One being they wanted to destroy the railroad bridge over the Swanee River at Columbus. Then they wanted to move on to the state capital, Tallahassee, and take it. And some accounts say they wanted to install a union government, make Florida a union state again rather than a southern secessionist state. And then another account says they eventually wanted to make their way up to Thomasville, Georgia, to rescue a bunch of Union prisoners up there who by that time had already been moved to the large prison outside of Andersonville, Georgia. But so they were met at this little railroad station, Olustee, by a Confederate force almost equivalent in size, a little over 5,000 men in a spectacular defensive position, and they turned back this Union force. So it was a Union defeat. The Battle of Olustee was a Confederate victory. The Union force retreated back to Jacksonville. And then they kind of reinforced themselves in Jacksonville, built forts and earthworks and all. And then the Union leadership were afraid that that big Confederate army that had beaten them back would go on the offensive and try to force the Union out of Northeast Florida. So they kept, a force in Jacksonville. They sent a force of troops up to Fort Clinch in Fernandina. They sent another force over to what was then called Fort Marion in St. Augustine. That's the Castillo, the fort there. And they sent a brigade of Union troops, Barton's New York Brigade, which had fought in the Olustee battle. They sent them here to Palatka. And the event that we portray occurs on the actual site. Colonel Barton and his officers billeted in the Bronson Mulholland House, and that's what we set up around. There would have been Union troops encamped around the house on the grounds. As Diane here knows, some Union troops occupied St. Mark's Episcopal Church and kind of set that up as their barracks, even brought their horses inside the church.
Oh my
Because a
goodness.
lot of the town had evacuated to inland because they
Okay.
thought they'd kind of like the Japanese in World War II. They thought that the U.S., the Union troops, were going to implement this reign of terror and all, which they didn't.
Right.
They weren't. But so there weren't many civilians left in town. Many of the churches, had been evacuated. So this Union force, billeted here in town to kind of reinforce Palatka and enable Union boat traffic to occur on the St. Johns River. Interestingly enough, so that's what we call the occupation of Palatka. And that's what we're portraying is when this Union force occupied the town. And so we try to tell that story. We've got Union soldiers there portraying some of the units that from Barton's brigade. We have a really great group of ladies who portray civilians of the period. So they kind of stand for the folks who were still here in town. We do have a few Confederate folks to kind of portray the militia that was in this area, and sometimes the troops that would come home on vacation, on leave, who still had family in the area. We portray some of our folks portray the medical, the doctors who ministered to the wounded troops, and even occasionally if a civilian person was sick, they would send the doctor or the ship's surgeon to help them. And they provided food and water to the civilians. So in particular, the Navy was kind of supportive of this area. So that's what we portray, and we're actually doing it on the actual historic site where it occurred. There are really only 3 reenactment events in Florida that occur on the actual site, and that is the Battle of Olustee reenactment, which occurs in February on the actual battlefield. The Battle of Natural Bridge, which is in March, that was in March 1865, the next year, and that occurs on the actual Natural Bridge battlefield out by Tallahassee, and this event, which occurs on
That's
the actual
incredible.
historical site. All the other reenactments occur on other sites that were not really where the event occurred.
Is that because of development?
Yeah, or the site is private property and they can't get access to it or whatever. Yeah.
That was a question I had, because as you think about the development of our communities, and I do believe that after my interview with Sam Carr, sharing how many of those historically preserved sites that we have, or even with like Billy Bartram's travel, you're able to go back and see it as he saw it then, and that's kind of a uniqueness that we have here in Putnam.
Yes. Yeah.
And so are these just volunteers, or are people who've had interest in doing this?
Yes, all of these folks are I'll call it amateurs or hobbyists, although there might be a few professional historians in the mix, but we do this. It's a hobby. It's something that we like to do. Some of these folks have invested thousands of dollars in their setup, in their impression. You'll see those at the event, which will be September 27th through 29th, the last full weekend of September. And yeah, it's sort of a labor of love, it's just because we love portraying the history and talking to folks and, having them learn and, actually see and put their hands on, the actual history.
There was something very special. I had the pleasure of being able to be in an impression.
Yep. Saw you in your outfit.
Yeah, and it was incredible. And I've always... I think I share much like you. I wasn't very interested. I wanted to be a marine biologist when I was in kindergarten.
That's kind of what I started out as.
I was just sharing with my son. He had to write a paper for school, and he said that he wanted to bring a marine biology course into the classroom because he thought, that would be very interesting. And I said, well, that's what I wanted to do. And yesterday I found a picture of me in my marine biology outfit. But all that to say, history, much to much like you, was not very interesting for me. But I think as I've gotten older, I've come to appreciate, especially doing the podcast, how much history we have, and have become somewhat enamored with every stitch being hand sewn, and the limitation of goods that we had back then, natural fibers and the woodworking and the leather, and where how much man-made stuff we have now. This was all natural resources. So and then watching people like you invest in reading the history and coming out with the closest account as possible, and then sharing that information with the public is incredible. Now, you said they're professional, though. Some people are professional.
A few people in the hobby are actual professional historians. I don't think we've got any in our group. We do have an archaeologist, Chris Liddick, who's the staff archaeologist at the Osceola National Forest out in Baker and Columbia County. But yeah, there are a few, actual historians. But again, most of us, it just, we do it because we're just super interested in it. It's not a job or a profession.
How many people would you say show up to the occupation to participate?
Usually we have, I'd say, 30 to 40 reenactors who come, and then we've got volunteers from the Historic Society who are there kind of in supportive roles. They cook meals for us and help. The house will be open. The Putnam County Historical Museum will be open. St. Mark's Church will be open. Some of their members will be docents there at the church. This year, I'm anticipating possibly 100 or more reenactors, because this year is very special. This is the 160th anniversary of the actual occupation event, which kind of started in March of 1864. So 160 years ago.
Wow.
So a number of additional folks, they like big anniversaries like this.
Absolutely.
So we're going to have some additional groups there, additional folks showing up. Because it is a very special anniversary.
We were talking a little bit before we got rolling about how incredible it is that if you think about where we're at socially and as a humanity, how everything is so, again, man-made, technologically driven, but most of our history is the items and the ways that things are being portrayed now. Obviously, as inventions come along, we modernize things, but much of what we had is like this, and it seems so foreign in some way, but really this is the foreign era that we're in now. So during the 3 days, you guys do education for our children in the community, correct?
Yes. Friday, September 27th is school day. Most events try to do a school day. In this case, we host the 4th grade classes from Putnam County schools and homeschool and charter school groups. I want to emphasize any homeschool or charter school group is also welcome to come on out. It usually runs in the morning because the kids got to be back at school probably right around or after lunch.
Right.
So between like 8:30 and 12:30, you're welcome to come, but you're going to have to kind of work your way around 800 or so screaming 4th graders. So we have them, and it is quite the experience for them. And then Saturday and Sunday are just general open to the public days. Very, very laid back. We should have at least one artillery piece there that every now and then is going to be firing off some black powder. So I do let the folks in the neighborhood know the week before I go around and stuff mailboxes that there's going to be some booms. Guys are also going to be doing musket fire demonstrations, and I'll show you a musket in a little bit.
Very, very thoughtful of you to do that.
Yeah.
Nothing would be more shocking. We anticipate fireworks on 4th of July, but the other night I heard fireworks going off but did not know, and I was very startled. So I'm sure the neighbors appreciate you with giving the heads up. I wonder how many children you spark interest in when they see this kind of stuff, because again, this is very foreign to them. So who knows how many people you're leaving impressions on, pun intended.
Yeah, yeah. So it's hard to say.
Yeah.
It's hard to say who we might get interested. We're always, I mean, I'm 67, nigh on 68, and you'll see a lot of us are kind of getting up there, gray-haired. We love to recruit young folks, into the hobby, because we need them to keep it going. The day is going to come where I'm not going to be able to do this anymore. So definitely anything we can do to spark young folks' interest in doing this and doing living history.
I think
we definitely do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's important for us to honor that. I believe that there's a time where if we stop looking at where we came from and stop honoring the history, we're not going to be able to learn from those things in the same way. So we would encourage you, if someone was interested, and then we'll get into the great stuff that you brought, but if someone was interested in participating and learning about this, how would they go about that?
Well, attending an event like this is a great opportunity, because you'll get to meet the individual units. Kind of our the way we're broken down is there'll be like a Union Army unit, a Confederate Army unit. We have a couple different civilian groups that portray civilians. So you'll be able to talk to them, possibly even join them. There is a website, Florida Reenactors Online, all one word, all lowercase, Florida Reenactors Online. That's a statewide website, so that's got lists, reenactor units all over the state. So you can also look at that website to get some idea of who might be in your particular area, and but the best thing is really, some folks just kind of do it individually, but really this should be, it's best is this is a group activity. Join a group, join a unit. That way you learn. That way many units have extra equipment. So if you're brand new, if you're a fresh fish, they can loan you the gear. They can tell you, what's a good deal, what's not a good deal, what to stay away from as you start to buy your own stuff. They might have stuff for sale at a much lower price than you'd buy from a sutler new. So checking out that website and actually going to events and talking to the units there and ask, how can I get involved? I'm kind of interested. Okay. And they would love to help you.
Well, we'll be sure to leave that link below, and then you could just click on it. We won't have to worry about any issues spelling or any of that. We'll get that down below. Okay. So let's talk about what you're wearing.
So the occupation, again, it was mainly the Union Army unit that again, this was Barton's New York Brigade, consisting of the 47th New York Regiment, 48th New York Regiment, 115th New York Regiment, so these were all New York units, a battery of the 3rd Rhode Island Artillery, and a couple of companies from the 55th Massachusetts, which was a colored unit, a black unit, similar to the famed 54th Massachusetts, which was portrayed in the movie Glory. So your typical Union soldier, and you will see them at the event, that's what a Union soldier's uniform looks like. I don't have one, but you'll see them. So the sky blue woolen trousers, a navy blue coat called a sack coat, a 4-button sack coat, a cap called a bummer or a forage cap, and then he's got his leathers on with his cap box and cartridge box and such, and he's armed with a musket. Confederates were a little more heterogeneously outfitted because, many guys just kind of put together their own outfit. The Confederacy the southern states didn't have the resources to produce mass quantities of similar uniforms. So you'll see a few of them there at the event. Many of the guys were armed with some type of a long arm called a musket. This was probably the most common one. This is
I don't even know if we can get that full thing in shot. That's
so
incredible.
This is the model 1853 3-band Enfield rifled musket. Let me see, maybe if I can stand it up. And it actually saw service on both sides. It was one of the main long arms of the Confederate Army. It also saw a lot of service in the Union Army. Okay, so those are some of the guys you're going to see. Now let's get into some of kind of my stuff. Now,
Boy, that's a huge gun.
Yes, and this was, for the time, a very advanced weapon. This was a rifled musket. It shot a projectile called a mini ball, and it was much more accurate than the old smoothbore flintlock muskets like that were used in the War of 1812 or the Revolutionary War. And that's why there was such massive combat deaths in the Civil War, because they were using tactics from the ancient weapons, older weapons, with, you know, these much more modern weapons. They were, as you can see, not a flintlock. They were what's called a percussion cap, which, again, much more reliable than the flintlock. It could shoot in the rain as long as your powder was dry.
I'm going to put a sheet of paper,
Okay.
white paper, for some contrast
So,
there. Hopefully we'll be able to focus in on
So
that.
again, much
incredible.
more advanced weapon, and that was mainly what you, that will be what you see the both Union and Confederate soldiers carrying. They'll either be
So
carrying
both sets of
the
troops.
Enfield musket, or the, also a common Union was the Springfield 1860 Springfield rifled musket, which was pretty much built very similarly. It had a few minor differences, and you'll be able to see those at the event. They'll show you a Springfield and an Enfield. So those were the armies, okay? So let's talk about me a little bit, because this is not a soldier's outfit, okay? So particularly here in northeast Florida, the Union Navy was a major factor in helping the Union take control of much of northeast Florida. Going back in November of 1861, the Union Navy attacked Port Royal, South Carolina, and established a Navy base there because the main Union Navy base on the East Coast was up in Virginia at Hampton Roads, and so they needed supplemental bases to implement the blockade of the southern coast. So they took Port Royal, South Carolina, in November of 1861. Then they began working south, you know, almost like the Navy worked across the Pacific in World War II. In March of 1862, the Union Navy took Fernandina, Fort Clinch, turned it over to the Army. This was in early March, and on March 11th, a Union Navy force arrived across at the mouth of the St. Johns River. And they crossed the river bar and landed the 4th New Hampshire Infantry Regiment at Jacksonville. And then the Union Navy began to conduct probes up the St. Johns River. The first contact that Palatka had with the Union military was the Union Navy gunboat USS Ottawa, which arrived right off here, out here, on March 14th, 1862. The minutes of the First Presbyterian Church, which I attend, you can go back to the minutes from March of 1862, and it says on March 14th, 1862, the enemy entered Palatka. Because the gunboat arrived, and Captain Thomas Holdup Stevens, the captain of that boat, came ashore with some of his men. He talked to the folks. He told them, we're not here to threaten you. You know, we will only respond if we ourselves are threatened or shot at. Then we're going to shoot back. But if you, you know, behave peaceably towards us, we will behave peaceably towards you, and we'll even help you if we can. So that was kind of the beginning, and eventually the Union Navy established a small base at the mouth of the St. Johns River at what was then called Mayport Mills, but that's the current little city of Mayport, where a Navy base is today. The Navy base at Mayport. And it was really after that so the Navy helped take Fort Clinch at Fernandina. About the same time they were helping, you know, working up the St. Johns River here, a Navy warship landed at St. Augustine and kind of took back the fort there, Fort Marion. And really from early 1862 on, the St. Johns River was controlled by the Union Navy. The Confederate Navy never really had a strong presence here in Florida because there were no major ports like Charleston or Savannah or Mobile. And Florida had such an extensive coastline that it would have taken a massive amount of military resources, both Army and Navy, to defend the Florida coast. So in essence, Florida was kind of abandoned by the Confederacy. All of the Confederate Army units formed here in Florida were eventually pulled out by early 1862, and they were either sent up to Virginia to serve with Lee or to serve out on the Western Theater along the Mississippi. So, but the Union Navy was a major factor because of their ability to control the St. Johns River and to control the coast along the Atlantic coast. They really helped the Union very early in the war secure a strong foothold here in Northeast Florida, which they pretty much never reneged, never abandoned. They were here until the very end of the war. So I am dressed as a Union Navy seaman. This was your typical seaman's deck uniform. I've got the shirt called a jumper or a frock, kind of a flannel undershirt here. The pants, it's a cut. I don't know if you can see it.
Well, we'll take a picture of you and put it in here.
A fall front or a broad fall. And then along with the fact that there's a little tie in the back. A little tie in the back. This was so that you didn't have to use suspenders or a belt to keep your breeches up. The Union soldier had a cotton shirt underneath his sack coat with suspenders that kept his trousers up. But because the sailors do things like go up masts to work the sails and all that kind of thing, you don't want anything that could get hung up.
Brilliant.
So so that's why we have the fall front here. And then the scarf. Nowadays, the sailor's uniform still has a scarf, which is purely decorative. Back then, this was meant to be used like a sweat towel or something, as a headband. So it had an actual use, and they would just tie it around their neck as a convenient place to put it. But it did have a use.
Then we got air conditioning and didn't have as much a need for it. Though in today's heat outside, I feel like everybody should have one of those on.
And then the standard part of the uniform was the flat hat. Seen here, what some folks call the crackerjack hat.
Crackerjack hat,
that was worn with the uniform. The uniform regulations also allowed the sailor to wear a broad-brimmed straw hat, but that was not particularly good for working because it would get in your way, it would blow off. So the sailor would usually wear his straw hat either on Sunday when the captain inspected the ship's company or on shore leave.
Okay.
Here's a picture here. This is an actual tintype made by a photographer who uses a period camera that I had done at an event a few years ago. So there's more the Sunday uniform, the white frock, and I've got the broad-brimmed straw hat with the navy blue trousers.
So we'll get a picture of this because this is, I guess, my mind when I was thinking about straw hats. Very nice.
That's what it's on. The chemicals were applied to this tin plate, and she's got the big old box camera that she puts it in there. Okay. And then instead of like a shutter, she just takes the lens cover off and then does 1/1000, 2/1000, 3/1000 to get the exposure. That's why everybody kind of has this stiff look in these old pictures because they can't move or it blurs. Because
and we were talking about tintype for the lockets, so this makes sense. I just had never seen it. That's incredible.
So there's a very talented lady up in Charleston. She calls herself the Charleston tin typist, Christine Eady, and she'll occasionally come to some of our Florida events and do tin types.
That's awesome.
I had asked if she could make it to our event, and she said, I can't this year.
Maybe next year.
Yeah. So that was kind of your typical deck seaman. In the Navy, you had your commissioned officers, and on Saturday at the occupation, I'll be in my Navy lieutenant's outfit.
Okay.
Because I'm kind of in charge, so you need a commissioned officer to be in charge.
Right.
So on ships, you had your commissioned officers, lieutenant commander, the guys who commanded the ship.
Right.
And then you had your enlisted sailors, of which you kind of had two types. You had your deck seamen who worked the deck, and then you had your petty officers who had this rate patch on, who were kind of in charge of groups of seamen.
Okay.
Basically, when the officer of the deck issued an order to do something, he would issue it to the petty officer in charge of a detail, and the petty officer would see to it that the men did it.
Okay.
So most of the ships in the Civil War, both North and South, were kind of hybrids. They were powered by sails. They had a sail rig, so you had to have your deck seamen who went up and worked the sails, and the various petty officers who were in charge of the different details on the mast. But most of the ships also had a steam engine. So there was, and this was very new for both navies, they had an engineering division. So they had the deck division who worked the deck and the sails and all, then the engineering division that worked the steam engine down in the bowels of the ship, and either the ship would be powered by paddle wheels or by what we call today a screw, a propeller driven by a shaft.
Okay.
So amongst the engineering, you had the really dirty job, the coal heavers who would shovel coal into the boilers. You had the firemen who were sort of like deck seamen. They worked the machinery. And then you had in command one or more engineers. You would have a chief engineer and then assistant engineers who just kind of supervised the operation of the engines.
Right.
So those were the different kind of groups aboard Navy ships in the Civil War. And again, I'm portraying a deck seaman, or in this case, a deck petty officer. This is a quartermaster. Some of the petty officer, they were called rates, not ranks. The Navy is always very different. The Navy uses very different words from the Army. So in the Army, you had ranks. The only ranks were the commissioned officers, the lieutenants, the commanders, the captains. But amongst the enlisted, it's called a rate. So you're rated as a seaman or you're rated as a petty officer. And then there were the different petty officer rates, some of which we still have today. Bosun's mate, who's still responsible for running the deck, gunner's mate, who's responsible for the ship's armament, quartermaster, we still have that today, who is responsible for, in the Navy, manning the helm. The ships that steers the ship. And back in the Civil War, the quartermasters also helped the officer of the deck with signaling and navigation. If you had to signal to another ship using the flags, signal flags, and, help the ship's master with navigation, plotting your positions and that kind of thing.
Right.
So that was kind of the basis of the Navy. And again, I think as I mentioned, the story of the Navy here in Florida is mainly the Union Navy, which was present all around the state. I mean, from Fernandina, wrapping all the way around to Key West, which that was the main East Gulf Squadron Navy base down in Key West. Key West was never taken over by the Confederates. It always remained in Union hands, and it was the headquarters of one of the Union blockade squadrons. Then up the Gulf Coast, the Union Navy took Egmont Key at the mouth of Tampa Bay. And as we talked about, I think earlier, they took Seahorse Key in the Cedar Keys, and these were kind of secondary bases. And then they went all the way around the Panhandle. Pensacola Navy Base, which is still a Navy base. Yeah. At first, at the beginning of the war, it was taken over by the Confederates. But when the decision was made to withdraw the Confederate Army from Florida, the Union was able to take over Pensacola Navy Base again, so it became a Union Navy base. And then they just kept on going across Alabama and Mississippi.
That's quite a bit away.
But the entire Florida coast was patrolled by Union Navy gunboats and warships implementing the blockade. And as part of that, like here in Northeast Florida, they would make forays up the rivers. Union Navy landing parties would conduct shore raids to disrupt the southern economy, particularly over on the Gulf Coast. Salt was an extremely critical commodity because there was no refrigeration. So the only way to preserve meat and other perishable foodstuffs was to pack it in salt. And about half of the salt the Confederate states, the southern states, used was imported before the war. It came from salt flats in the Bahamas or salt mines over in Europe.
Right.
And the Union Navy blockade cut that off. So salt making here in Florida, the construction of salt works to boil down seawater to extract salt, was a big industry. And the Union Navy would conduct raids to bust these facilities up.
Right.
And then turpentining, or what were called naval stores, the production of stuff from pine sap, which included turpentine, various kinds of gums and rosins, tar, produced from pine sap in turpentine stills. So that was another target of Union Navy raids, was busting up these turpentine stills. They were called naval stores because they were largely used to waterproof ships, the wood, the canvas, the
that makes
ropes,
sense.
you know, to waterproof these things so they wouldn't rot so quickly. So turpentine in particular was another major commodity produced in Florida during the war that was often a target of both Union Navy and Army raids. So a typical Union Navy sailor, he could be armed just like I showed you, like a soldier, with the musket and with the bayonet. This was the bayonet that went on the tip of the musket.
What that looked like.
So a sailor might be armed with the musket and bayonet like a soldier, or could be armed with a pistol and cutlass. So this was the model 1851 Navy Colt pistol, which was carried by a lot of sailors.
Wow.
And it was also a cap and ball type thing, fired with black powder and percussion caps. The sailor wore it on his belt in this thing called a frog, which was just kind of a little holder.
Right.
You can see. And then this is the model 1860 Navy Cutlass. It's an edged weapon that would also be carried with the pistol that the sailor would carry. And that was partly why, partly a reason I picked doing Navy was, number one, I guess, people don't think of the Navy when they think of the Civil War. They think of General Grant, General Lee, the armies, Gettysburg, all that. And that kind of makes sense because total, North and South, over 6 million men served in the armies. So it definitely was an army war, but both sides, there was a Confederate Navy, there was a Union Navy, and so those navies were important to both sides' war effort.
Yeah.
So that's some of the weapons that, and then partly, so I went into Navy because, people don't think of the Navy, so it gives me a real educational opportunity. My dad served a hitch in the Navy in the Korean War, so there was that. And then I get to play with more toys than a soldier plays with. Again, sometimes I'm outfitted with the musket and bayonet, and then sometimes I wear my pistol and cutlass. So I get
that is something that someone who served in the Army would not have had.
Yeah, the interesting thing about the Navy is in the Army, typically only commissioned officers, the lieutenants and captains and majors, only they were allowed to carry an edged weapon like a sword and a sidearm like a pistol. Occasionally, a senior sergeant, a sergeant major, would have a sword, but it was more ceremonial that he would use at dress, that kind of thing. It wasn't a real combat weapon. But in the Navy, enlisted men could carry an edged weapon, the cutlass, and a sidearm like a pistol. It kind of depended on the nature of the mission. If they were in a landing party, the officer in charge would say, issue the men musket and bayonet or pistol and cutlass or some combination. Obviously the pistol and cutlass are kind of close range weapons. They would be worn probably say if they were boarding a Confederate blockade runner, to capture it. Whereas if they were on a shore party excursion, they'd probably be musket and bayonet because they'd be operating at, much farther ranges and that kind of thing. A sailor's day aboard ship was spent in a lot of drill. So there would be, drill with the small arms. There would be general quarters drill, and in fact, your typical sailor had quite a bit more skills than a soldier. The soldier was trained to, march in formation, to maneuver on the field, to understand the commands to maneuver on the field, and to shoot his musket. But your typical deck seaman, okay, he helped work the ship, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. He had specific jobs aboard the ship. He was trained in the pistol and cutlass to handle a musket, to shoot a musket, and they were also trained to work the deck guns on the ship.
Okay.
The big guns, the cannons, if you will, on the ship. So most sailors served on a gun crew if the ship was in combat or engaged with a fort or something like that. So the sailor had a variety of skills. So a lot of drills. So there'd be small arms drill with the pistol and musket. There would be drill on the big guns, to learn how to work the deck guns.
Right.
Fire drill, because these were mostly wooden ships with turpentine and tar and lots of combustible stuff. So when these ships caught on fire, it was a very dangerous thing. General quarters, go to battle stations and the different men manning the guns and all that kind of thing. Cutlass drill. So
yeah, would be very interested to see what that would look like.
We'll do some cutlass drill at the Occupation event. This is called single stick, and this was what the sailors would use to drill on the cutlass. To practice.
Have you manufactured some of these replicas yourself?
Yes, of course these I bought. From settlers, but. Yeah, this I made from a pattern of how to do a single stick. So that's leather.
Can I hold it?
Yeah. Okay. So.
Wow, that's incredible.
So there's lots of stuff out there, patterns that you can make. A lot of folks make their own stuff.
Yeah.
I ended up buying a lot of my stuff.
It's a judgment-free zone here. Did you say that you purchased from settlers?
Yes.
So those are people who have, and correct me if I'm wrong, I'm always trying to learn something new, where they have officially gone back and proven that they have history within settling in Florida. Is that correct?
So traditionally, what we call sutlers, these were S-U-T-L-E-R-S.
Okay, I heard settlers.
These were vendors who would follow the armies around, and they would sell the soldiers things that the army wouldn't issue them, tobacco, candy, little notions, of stuff that they didn't get with their uniform issue. Sometimes they could be a bit predatory on the soldiers, and the sailors might encounter sutlers if they came on shore here, and if there was an army unit here. Typically aboard ship, there was a commissioned officer called a paymaster who had some of these little notions that the sailors could buy with their pay, or it would be deducted from their pay when they were paid. Again, things like tobacco and stuff that they were not issued as part of their uniform issue. Nowadays, the folks we call sutlers are the people who provide us with this kind of stuff. You can buy muskets and edge weapons and pistols from them, uniforms, everything, hats. So, stuff that you need, the leather stuff that you need for your impressions. So many of these sutlers come to the larger reenactment events. They'll have a big tent there that the reenactors, anybody can go in and shop and all. They make dresses, lady stuff too, as well as men's stuff.
Yeah.
And a lot of these folks have websites too, so you can go to the Fall Creek Sutlery or Blockade Runner Sutlery.
Sutler, not settler.
Yeah, Sutler, S-U-T-L-E-R.
That makes a big difference.
You can buy this stuff.
Wonderful. All right, thank you for clarifying. I'm glad to know that.
So as I mentioned, so a sailors did engage in combat, shore party raids and such, again, either with the musket or the pistol and cutlass. And then, of course, the sailors also operated the ship. And a well-trained, if you joined the Navy with absolutely no skills at all, you were rated as a landsman. So
Okay.
so that was your rate, a landsman. And so you would go into a kind of the basic training back then was really short, a couple of weeks or so aboard of what was called a receiving ship, and then you would be sent to a real ship where a lot of your training
On the job training.
So, and then once you acquired some skills, you would be called an ordinary seaman. And once you acquired even more specialized skills, you would become a seaman. Or
Okay.
in some cases, it's called able seaman.
Able
So
seaman.
landsman, ordinary seaman, able seaman. And then if you really got good, you would be rated as a petty officer. You would get your
Okay.
petty officer rating, and you would be actually in charge of some men. But some of the different skills that were learned aboard ship, as I mentioned, most of the ships, particularly both larger and smaller, had a sail rig. So they had one or more men who had sailmaker's skills. This was one of the tools they used. This is a sailmaker's palm used for forcing the needle through the heavy sail canvas.
Oh.
Kind of like a thimble, but on steroids.
A handle.
So sailmaker's palm. And then this is another sailmaker's tool. It's just used for rubbing down the seams on the canvas, getting
Did
a
you
good tight
fabricate
fold.
these things?
This I made. This I bought.
Okay.
You can still buy, sort of primitive type sailmakers tools, because some folks who have a sailboat, particularly an older sailboat,
Right.
they really get into doing the traditional. They
Right.
work on their own sails and their own canvas, work on their own rope and lines and all.
Right.
So yeah, some sailboat people really get. So you can still buy sailmakers palms and all this. This I made from just looking at a picture of a seam rubber.
That's pretty
So-
darn cool.
And then, as mentioned, a lot of the ships were wood, still made of wood. So they had a carpenter's division with, I'll have some woodworking tools at my display at the occupation. Here's a woodworking tool here. Some folks call this a spoke shaver. It's just used for shaping,
Yeah.
shaving and shaping wood. And various other woodworking tools. So the ship's carpenter and his mates were responsible for generally the upkeep of the ship. The
Right.
deck, caulking the deck. If they had to put a new coat of turpentine or something on some of the woodwork, they would
Right.
do that. And then another skill of a sailor, particularly a ordinary seaman or able seaman, was the rope work.
Okay.
Knowing a well-trained seaman had a variety of rope skills, knots, knot work. This was some of the tools that would have been in any basic seaman's kit. These are called fids, and they're used for working rope, for splicing rope. A well-trained seaman.
So not for slaying vampires.
No, not for slaying vampires. A well-trained seaman, and I did not do this, could splice two ends of the rope together. And what he did was, he would use the fid to take apart, these main fibers and then weave them back together again. And it's as strong as the original rope.
That's incredible.
So splicing. And I'll probably mess this up, but so knots, the right knot in the right place. So let's say you had, you needed to throw a line to another ship or to a ship's boat or something like that, and the line that you had wasn't long enough. Okay, so it's what you would call bend two lines together. Sailors, they had their own culture and they had their own language, and sailor talk is very different. So, rather than tie two lines together, they would bend two lines together. So this is called a reef knot. So this is the one line here. Here's the second line. We would bring it up, around, and this, I knew I'd mess it up. So up
Well,
and around.
we could always, through the magic of
through.
recording, just make it happen.
And there it is.
Ah.
So there's a reef knot. Two lines bent together.
I should have watched that more carefully because I could have used that 100 times.
Okay, so there's one knot that the sailors knew.
Is that something that you guys show at Occupation?
Yes,
Okay.
yeah. So that's what I try to do is demonstrations. You know, if you want to put a loop in a rope in a line, maybe to toss over a bollard or something, you'd use a bowline. So I don't know if you could see. So
you kind of fold it over on itself.
kind of do what's called an overhand loop.
Uh-huh.
Yep. And then you go up, around, and through. And there you go. You got a loop in the end of your line that you could throw over something, you know, if you just need to moor temporarily. So a whole variety, you know, there's half hitches and clove hitches and such, which I'm still trying to learn, but a whole variety of knots and the right knot in the right, you know,
somebody had to
right
test
job.
all those knots at some point to create them. Like, oh, this is the knot that works. So this
Another
is the one that
skill
isn't.
was whipping. Okay. For a variety of reasons, you don't want the end of a line to look like that,
right.
like a cow's tail. So to keep it neat, you would whip the end of the line with a smaller piece of cord, and that keeps it together. And then you dip it into some turpentine to kind of seal off the ends there. So these are the variety of rope skills: splicing, knots, whipping, seizing is another skill that the sailors would have. And this was all stuff that they had to use on their daily chores on the deck.
Right. How cool. And to think that, you know, all of this is something that they taught throughout, you know, from one person to another.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Usually it was the petty officers, particularly in terms of the deck skills like this, the bosun's mates would be, you know, again, as part of the drill, probably a bosun's mate or a senior bosun's mate would, at some point during the day, have a class of landsmen, you know, the least trained, doing knot work or teaching them whipping or splicing or some type of a skill to bring them along.
That makes sense.
So one of the tools, if you will, that the bosun's mates would use to help run the deck was this thing here, and I'm sure some folks will recognize it. It's called a bosun's pipe, but it's a type of whistle, and I'm going to try it in a little bit and hopefully not shatter everybody's ear. But as part of their responsibility to run the deck, the ship's bosun and his mates, the bosun's mates, when the officer of the deck issued an order, they were responsible for seeing that order carried out, to see that the men went to work, that they did the job. In particular, one of the things they had to do was go up the masts to work the sails. And this particular thing is used back in the Civil War, was used ceremonially, which I'll talk about in a little bit, but it also had a specific job. Today, bosun's mates still use the pipe, but it's largely ceremonial.
Okay.
But back in the Civil War, this still had a very specific job. So if the sailors were up in the masts, up in the tops, working the sails, if there was anything more than a strong breeze blowing, anything stronger than a strong breeze, the sound of the wind through the rigging would make this howl that, you know, the voice wouldn't carry up to the mast. Voice commands wouldn't carry. So in response to the officer of the deck's order, a bosun's mate, who usually a bosun's mate would be in charge of each mast. He would be called captain of the foretop or captain of the main top. That would be a petty officer, and he would be in charge of the men up there. So he would go to the mast and he would do a signal on this thing and then the sailors would be trained to know, oh, that means shorten sail 1 point, you know, something like that. Okay. So just like in the Army, in the Civil War, they used the bugle calls when the troops were spread over hundreds of acres. They would do the bugle calls to let the guys know, you know, retreat or reform or something like that. So in the Army, they used the bugle calls on the field. In the Navy, they'd use the bosun's pipe to issue orders to the guys up in the tops to know what to do.
Wonderful.
It would also be a way of getting the sailors' attention, you know, on deck if you needed to. And then the pipe was also used ceremonially, and still is today, at least on some ships, when the captain would leave the ship. And when he would come back aboard, or if another senior officer, like the captain of another ship or an admiral, was coming aboard, as a way of showing respect, as the senior officers were coming up the gangplank from the dock, the bosun's mates would assemble on one side of the deck, and if the ship had a marine, they would be on the other side facing the bosun's mates, and as the captain or admiral came aboard, as their foot would hit the deck, they would pipe them aboard, and the Marines would come to present, their muskets and all, so it would be very, pomp and circumstance kind of a thing.
How cool.
And again, still used today in that regard, and some I guess. I've never been in the Navy, but I've got a lot of my friends have. And some of them say on some ships, the captain's just not interested in this anymore. But in others, he's still a traditionalist. So on the ship's intercom, if they needed to get the attention of the crew, they do, now hear this, now, they would have a bosun's mate pipe.
Right.
So that's yet another thing that would be used.
Reminds me of Mary Poppins when I can't remember the character's name, but they were getting ready to fire off the bow or fire off.
There was that captain that was next to, and then the other one that everybody remembers is Sound of Music, because remember the Von Trapps, which is based on a real thing. The father was a submarine captain for the Germans in World War One, and so you remember he would order the kids around using his bosun's pipe, to order them what to do there. So that's what everybody kind of remembers. But yeah, there was the guy who would fire off his cannon from the roof there at Mary Poppins. Interestingly enough, both movies had Julie Andrews. So.
That's the theme here. We didn't even know it was one. Those are so cool. That's amazing.
So that's just some of the stuff that the sailors would use, and again, I'll be in front of the Bronson House. I'll have a big canvas canopy called a fly, and I'll have a huge display with all my my tools and weapons and such, and be talking to folks about the Navy, because the St. Johns River is right there.
Exactly.
And during the Civil War, pretty much from early 1862 on, the folks here in Palatka would be used to seeing a Union Navy gunboat go cruising by. If not every day, at least a few times a week. Again, they would be on patrol, looking for trouble, looking to capture barrels of turpentine or bales of cotton, which was called back then contraband of war, because it was what the South would use to finance their war effort. Then Union Navy everywhere, but also here on the St. Johns River, freed many slaves. As slaves learned about the presence of the Navy on the river, they would make their way to the river and flag down a Navy gunboat. They would pick them up, and they ended up across from Mayport Mills. There was a area called Pilot Town. They would put these refugee slaves there to keep them. Interestingly enough, whereas again, if you've seen the movie Glory, you know that when the Union Army took in African Americans, they kept them in segregated units, serving together, commanded by white officers. Both navies, Union and Confederate, were integrated. Black sailors served alongside white sailors. Now, it wasn't hunky-dory. There was still, discrimination and such, but, you'll see, and a lot depended on the biases of the captain or not, whether he was more egalitarian, encouraging, that kind of thing or not. But you'll see deck pictures of Union ships with white faces and black faces, and there's some of those in my book. A number of black folks who grew up in a particular area, whether it was the St. Johns River or Charleston or whatever, both navies hired them as pilots to guide the warships in and out of the harbor, because they knew where the deep channels were, and could go in and out. There were a number of black pilots here on the St. Johns River who mostly helped the Union Navy. A lot of them had to be taken to Pilot Town, because if the Confederates got them, they would have killed them, because you were colluding with with the enemy.
Right.
Going back to the occupation, one question which I'm occasionally asked is, well, how long did the occupation last? Surprisingly, not long. Again, Barton's brigade was landed in March of 1864. By May of 1864, barely 2-3 months later, they were all withdrawn. All the Union troops were withdrawn.
Wow.
The reason that was because the main way the Army was able to reinforce and supply their garrisons along the river was by the river, okay?
Right.
Because the Confederates, Captain Dickinson and his cavalry, largely controlled the interior, and he could cross the river too. So they couldn't resupply by land. So the Union Army leased civilian steamers to act as transports, to bring men and supplies and livestock, horses and such, up and down the rivers. And one of those transports was a big steamer called the Maple Leaf. And on March 31st of 1864, the Maple Leaf in the evening dropped off some troops here at Palatka to help reinforce the brigade here. And then they were heading downriver back to Jacksonville or Mayport. And early on the morning of April 1st, the Maple Leaf struck what were then called torpedoes, Confederate mines, explosive devices. The Confederates had planted a bunch of these torpedoes or mines around Mandarin Point, which is downstream of here. And the Maple Leaf hit one of those and was sunk. And actually, a couple weeks later, another Union transport, the General Hunter, hit a mine in that same area and was sunk. So the Union leadership kind of panicked, because they said, if we can't use the river because the Confederates have this thing mined, where the garrison here at Palatka is essentially abandoned.
Right.
So they pulled him out. And so that the Union occupation ended roughly in May or so, June of 1864. After that, there would just be kind of small raiding parties up here. Either the Union Navy would come up, land some sailors and Marines to look around to see what kind of trouble, or Army company, a relatively small 100 guys or so of Army soldiers who would kind of come through the area and sweep. There's a story of which is it's on the Putnam County Historical Society website, and the book The River Runs North also has it. The first elected governor of Florida was William Moseley. And after he finished his term, he built a house outside of Palatka here, had a plantation, and he was fairly friendly with the Union Navy. When they would land, they would talk to Governor Moseley. And then one day the Union Navy came in and landed, and it was the gunboat E.B. Hale, I believe, a fellow named Snell in command. And he was out to arrest Governor Moseley because he had earlier asked Governor Moseley if, are there any Confederate troops in town? Governor Moseley said, no, there's no Confederate units, no Confederate troops in town. And at some point in his patrols, he saw guys in gray kind of slipping through town here. So he comes ashore, and he's going to arrest Governor Moseley for lying to them. And then he's going to go and he's going to shell the town. And so a local lady, Mrs. Mary Boyd, came to him and pleaded with him. She was saying, he was not lying to you. There were just a few guys here in town on leave visiting their family. Right. And she ended up talking the captain into, no, don't arrest the governor, don't shell the town.
Oh my gosh.
Because we're not hostile here. So
Right.
it's the story, I think, is called The Governor and the Gunboat.
The Governor and the Gunboat.
And I've done that. I've portrayed that with Connie Sowers with the Glorious Victorians. She portrays Mary Boyd, and I portray Snell, and I'm going to shell this town into oblivion. You know, so I get to really, you know, play the bad guy.
Nice. I just think this is all super incredible, and I first want to thank you for taking the time to, in this heat at that, come in your authentic wear here and to show me all these things. I think it's incredible what you've handcrafted yourself. I mean, I would have never guessed that wasn't fabricated by, you know, someone else, you know, just a machinery work, if you will. And giving us the education. I think it's simply incredible that you guys do that for our youth in this community. And I am very excited, especially now that I have gotten into history, coming to look at or view and experience the occupation with new eyes. So I look forward to seeing what you've got set up there and what everybody else brings to the table. And again, there are both Union and Confederate that'll be there, and then civilians.
And civilians, yeah.
And so that'll be very interesting to see how all that comes together in only 3 months. And we've been celebrating it or honoring it for 160 years. That's incredible.
Yeah. So September 27th through the 29th, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, from 9 till 2. Although if you come after 2, you know, the folks will probably still talk to you.
Right.
Because they love talking about this stuff. So
and if you are a homeschooler or do virtual school and you'd like to come and be present, but with 800 screaming fourth graders, I think was the term we used.
Yes.
If you're up to the battle of its own, you're welcome to come down and join. But we'll leave links below for you guys. Add it to your calendars. It's definitely something to, if you haven't taken it in, you really should. And it helps promote sharing history and helping out the Historical Society at that.
Yes. So yeah, and Putnam County Historical Society is a big sponsor. They're really kind of our support. They kind of support us reenactors as we do our thing. They do a really nice little reception for us on Friday evening. And then if you're interested, Saturday afternoon between 3:30 and 5:30, I think a bunch of us are going to go down to Azalea City Brewery and invade there for a cold pint or two.
I love it. Well, thank you so much for joining me and sharing all that you have. Oh, one of the things you were sharing with me is you have a book in here, right? Would you like to tell us about that?
The shameless self-promotion.
No, it's not shameless. I brought it up.
So, you know, I kind of got so into this. Well, let me say this. Between 2011 and 2015, that was the 150th anniversary of the Civil War, what's called the sesquicentennial of the Civil War.
That's a mouthful.
And during sesquicentennial, but during that time, from 2011 to 2015, I was a contributing blogger to it was actually an actual official U.S. Navy website called the Civil War Navy Sesquicentennial. So I contributed to it. I largely contributed posts that, you know, on this date, March whatever, 1862, the gunboat USS Ottawa landed at the town of Palatka. You know, so I do these posts of, you know, what happened on this date, particularly here in Florida with naval activities. I did some posts on Georgia and Alabama too, but mainly Florida. And when I was all done with that in 2015, again, I'd done the research, you know, I had books and articles and reports that I had obtained from libraries and such. And I wondered, can I put together a book on this? There's some great books out there on, you know, the Navy in Florida in the Civil War, but it's interesting. One kind of just covers the Gulf Coast. Another, Dr. Schaefer's book covers Northeast Florida here. And then some of the others sort of cover a little bit of Navy, a little bit of Army, sort of, you know, the whole theater in Florida. So I said, I wonder if I can put together a book that covers all of the naval actions in Florida. And so basically I started with my blog posts and just kind of expanded on them and then put together my book.
Civil War Navy in Florida.
Yes. And Needful Things Downtown has some. So got to
I
give a
love
plug
that.
for our
Yeah,
little local bookstore.
absolutely.
He's got some. You can also get it off, the big boys, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, or any local bookseller can
Wonderful.
can
And you
get this
said you'd
for
have
you.
that at the
And I
Occupation,
will
correct?
have copies available at the Occupation, which I will sign for you.
I love that.
To get the book personalized. So
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for your time. I found this exceptionally interesting, and I hope that you enjoyed it too. Be sure to follow along with the Historical Society is doing. But until next time, guys, we'll see you on the next episode. Thank you for joining.
yes, thank you, Laura.